This is not a story about a perfect man. It is not a story about a fearless hero who woke up one morning and decided to do the right thing. This is a story about a tired, stubborn, deeply frightened rancher named Dale Mercer, a man who knew the truth for 3 long years and said absolutely nothing. A man who watched injustice unfold from the window of his own kitchen every single morning and convinced himself, day after day, that staying quiet was the same thing as staying safe. And it is a story about the woman who refused to let him believe that lie anymore. Dale Mercer was the kind of man the land makes. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red rock that framed his property in eastern Montana. He had grown up on that ranch, 1,400 acres his grandfather had broken with a mule land, a prayer back in 1931. By the time Dale inherited it at 34, the land already felt like a second skin. He knew every fence post, every water line, every dry creek bed that flooded without warning in April. He knew this place the way most men never get to know anything in their lives. He had built his whole identity around being a man of few words and steady hands. In Cowboy County, that meant something. People trusted Dale Mercer not because he talked much, but precisely because he didn't. When he shook your hand, you knew where you stood. When he said something, he meant it. That reputation had taken decades to build, and he guarded it the way he guarded the property lines of his ranch, quietly, firmly, and without compromise. His wife, Clara, had loved that quality in him once. She had married it, in fact. She had watched him across a church social in 1998, barely saying a word while every other man in the room performed themselves like actors at an audition, and she had thought that one knows who he is. She had been right. For the first 12 years of their marriage, his stillness had been her shelter. She had raised their 2 children, Nate and Lori, in a house where words were used carefully and silence was not uncomfortable. But silence, she would come to learn, has more than one face. It was the summer of 2019 when everything changed, though Clara would later say she didn't understand how much had changed until almost a year after it happened. It started with the cattle. Dale had noticed it first in May 3 of his Angus steers behaving strangely near the south pasture fence line. They were lethargic, stumbling, refusing water. He called the vet out, a young woman named Dr. Patel who had taken over the practice in town 2 years prior. She ran her tests, frowned at her results, and told Dale the animals were showing signs of chemical toxicity, but she couldn't pin down the source yet. He thanked her, paid her bill, and told her he'd keep an eye on things. He lost 6 head of cattle that summer. 6 animals, each one worth real money, each one a blow to a ranch operation that was already running lean after 2 drought years. He grieved those animals the way ranchers do, quietly and without ceremony, because grief on a working ranch is a luxury you take in small doses. But it wasn't the cattle that broke something open inside Dale. It was what he saw in late August, on a Tuesday night, when he couldn't sleep and walked out to the south barn at 2 in the morning. The moon was full that night, bright enough to throw shadows. And, in that silver light, Dale Mercer stood at the edge of his property and watched 2 unmarked tanker trucks roll slow and deliberate down the service road that ran along the southern boundary of the neighboring property, a stretch of land that had been purchased 18 months earlier by a holding company called Cavern Ridge LLC. He watched those trucks idle near the old drainage swale. He watched men in hazmat gear climb out, connect hoses, and begin pumping something into the ground. He stood in the dark for 40 minutes and watched the whole thing. Then, he walked back to his house, climbed into bed next to Clara, and said nothing. He told himself he needed more information. He told himself he needed to be sure. He told himself that making accusations against a company, especially one with the kind of legal resources a holding company could afford, was not something a man did on the basis of one night's observation. These were the things he said to himself in the days that followed, and they were not entirely untrue. But underneath all of it was something else. Something he would not name for a long time. He had done some quiet research on Cavern Ridge LLC in the weeks after that August night. What he found had not reassured him. The company had ties, not obvious, not documented in ways that would hold up in court, but present if you knew how to look, to Vincent Harlow. And Vincent Harlow was not a man you moved against lightly. Harlow was 61 years old, and he had spent the last 3 decades building a quiet empire in Cowboy County. He owned the grain elevator, the largest equipment dealership in a 70-mile radius, 2 commercial properties on Main Street, and had been a major donor to 3 consecutive county sheriff campaigns. His son-in-law was a state legislator. His name appeared on the boards of 2 local banks. He had never been charged with anything more serious than a traffic infraction, and he had never lost a civil lawsuit in the county, though he had been involved in 4 of them. Dale had grown up watching Vincent Harlow. He knew what kind of weight a man like that could throw around. He knew what happened to people who made enemies of men like that in small, closed communities where everybody knew everybody and favors ran like an underground river, invisible, but constant. So he stayed quiet. And the months passed. Clara noticed something shift in him that fall. She was perceptive in that particular way that long marriages create, not reading minds, but reading bodies. She noticed that Dale started checking the south fence line every morning before breakfast, something he hadn't done before. She noticed he had started sleeping badly. He was irritable in small ways he'd never been before, snapping at the dog, leaving things half-finished. He stopped going to the monthly Cattlemen's Association meetings, which he had attended faithfully for 11 years. She asked him once, in October, if something was wrong. He said no. His voice was flat in a way that told her he was lying, but she had not pushed him then. She had given him space because that was their way, and because she trusted still, at that point, that if something were truly wrong, he would find his way to telling her. She was wrong about that. By January 2020, the problems with the water had spread. Dale's neighbor to the east, a retired schoolteacher named Pete Ashford who ran a small hobby farm, called him one afternoon to mention that his well had started running strange, cloudy water, a sharp chemical smell. Pete was 73 and not the type to alarm himself over nothing, so when he said it quietly and, almost apologetically, Dale felt the ground shift under him slightly. He drove out to Pete's place that afternoon. He looked at the water. He smelled it. He knew. He drove home, sat in his truck in the driveway for 20 minutes, then went inside and ate dinner and said nothing. It was Clara who first noticed the smell in their own water in February. She was washing dishes on a Thursday evening when she stopped, held the glass up to the kitchen light, and looked at Dale across the counter. "This smells wrong," she said. Dale didn't answer immediately. He picked up his coffee cup, looked down at the table. "Could be the pipes," he said. Clara set the glass down carefully. She looked at her husband for a long moment, the way she had learned to look at him over 22 years, searching not his words but the architecture of his face. "Dale," she said. "What do you know?" He said nothing. That was the moment the silence between them changed its nature entirely. Because Clara Mercer was not a dramatic woman, and she was not a confrontational one. But she was paying attention. And what she saw in her husband's face in that moment was not the blankness of a man who had nothing to say. It was the rigid stillness of a man holding something down with every ounce of strength he had left. She didn't push him that night. But, from that night forward, something shifted in her too. Because now she wasn't just worried about her husband. She was beginning to understand that her husband's silence was not only his to keep. It belonged to all of them now. She started making calls the following week quietly, carefully, the way she did everything. She called the county health office about the water quality. She called the state environmental hotline and filed a preliminary report. She began keeping a notebook, writing down dates and observations and everything Pete Ashford had told her. She drove out to the south fence line one morning while Dale was in the north pasture and took photographs of the ground near the drainage swale, the dead grass, the discoloration in the soil, the strange oily residue that had crusted along the edge of the dry creek bed. When Dale found out what she had been doing, he was furious in the way that frightened men become furious, not hot and explosive, but cold and rigid. "You need to stop," he told her. "I'm not going to stop," she said. "Clara, you don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then, explain it to me." He turned and walked out of the room. She let him go. But she did not stop. The next 4 months were the hardest of their marriage. Dale and Clara had weathered drought years, a miscarriage, a financial crisis in 2009 that had nearly taken the ranch. They had disagreed before, argued before, gone to bed angry before. But they had never before been on fundamentally opposite sides of something this serious, and the weight of it pressed down on everything between them. Clara kept pushing. She wasn't loud about it, she wasn't a woman who raised her voice. But she was relentless in the quiet, specific way of someone who has decided that the stakes are too high to back down. She left articles on the kitchen table about environmental contamination cases. She told Dale what she had found when she'd started researching Cavern Ridge LLC herself. She brought up the cattle. She brought up Pete Ashford's well. She brought up their own water. Nate's going to want to bring his kids out here someday, she said one evening. You think about that? Dale said nothing. I think about it, she said. Every single day. He lay awake that night listening to her breathe in the dark, and, for the first time, he let himself feel the full weight of what he had been carrying. Not just the knowledge of what he had seen on that August night 3 years ago, but the weight of what his silence had allowed to continue. The cattle were gone. The water was compromised. Pete Ashford had started buying bottled water for everything. And, somewhere in the back of his mind, Dale Mercer had known for a long time that none of this was going to stop on its own. He just hadn't been ready to be the one to stop it. But Clara was ready. And she wasn't going to let him forget it. She would not relent. She would not soften. She would not give him the comfortable out of pretending that someone else would handle this, that the problem would solve itself, that a man could watch his land poisoned and his neighbor's water ruined and his own conscience corroded and simply write it out. She had made a decision, somewhere in those months, that she loved her husband too much to let him become the man he was slowly turning into. And so every morning she got up. And every morning she pushed. What she did not know yet, what neither of them knew, was that Dale had already started to crack. That the rigid wall of his silence had developed, in the privacy of his own sleepless nights, a fracture so deep and so wide that it was only a matter of time. She just had to keep pressing. And she did. The summer of 2020 arrived the way trouble often does in Montana, quietly at first, with nothing in the sky to warn you except a color that doesn't look quite right at dusk. Dale Mercer moved through those warm months like a man trying to hold two versions of himself together at once. On the surface, he was still the same rancher he had always been, up before the sun, working the animals, checking the fence lines, eating supper at 6. But, underneath all of that, something was happening to him that he could feel and could not stop, like a slow thaw in the deep ground under his feet. Clara had been pushing him for nearly 8 months by then. Not in theatrical ways, not with ultimatums laid out over the dinner table or threats that changed the geometry of the room. Clara's pressure was of a different kind. It was the kind that came from consistency. From being the same person every single day. From refusing to pretend. She would bring things up at ordinary moments, while they were driving to town, while she was folding laundry, while they sat on the porch watching the evening cool off, and she would say what she thought with a directness that had no meanness in it, only weight. "There's a woman over in Billings," she told him one morning in June. She set a folded piece of paper next to his coffee cup without making a production of it. Environmental attorney. "She's handled cases like this before. I called her office." Dale looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. "Clara, I'm not asking you to call her today," she said. "I'm asking you to read the paper." She went back to her eggs. Dale looked at the paper for a long moment, then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. She noticed. She didn't say a word about it. What Clara could not fully see, from where she stood, was how much Dale was actually listening. The silence she met from him every day looked the same from the outside, closed off, immovable, a wall made of old habits and old fear. But, inside that silence, things were shifting. He had started replaying that August night in 2019 with a different kind of attention. Not the attention of a man looking for reasons to stay quiet, but the attention of a man trying to build something solid enough to stand on. He had started writing things down. Not in any kind of organized way, just notes, on the back of feed receipts and equipment invoices, scratched out in pencil in his blunt block handwriting. Dates. Times. What he had seen. The trucks, the men, the hoses. the direction the drainage ran, the location of the swale relative to the property line. He kept these notes in the glove box of his truck, which he figured was the one place in his life that was entirely his own. He had also started paying attention to things he had previously trained himself to ignore. He drove past the Caver Ridge parcel twice a week now, noting the vehicle traffic, the comings and goings, the way the access road showed tire tracks after dry weather. He noticed that one of the men he'd seen on the tanker truck crew, a heavyset man with a red beard, drove a pickup that was sometimes parked outside the Harlow equipment lot on Route 9. He wrote that down too. He didn't tell Clara any of this. Partly because he was not ready. And partly because some stubborn part of him resented that she had been right, and he needed time to arrive at the truth on his own terms, even if he was arriving at exactly the same destination she had already found. The fracture in him widened in July, because of Pete Ashford. Pete had been hospitalized in late June, not for anything directly attributable to the water, not in any way that a doctor would put in writing and connect to chemical contamination. But the old man had developed respiratory issues and a persistent skin condition that his physician described, in careful language, as consistent with prolonged low-level chemical exposure. Pete was not a man who complained. He was the kind of 73-year-old who still mowed his own lawn and drove himself to appointments and made his own soup from scratch. Seeing him in that hospital bed, thin and paper-skinned and trying to make small talk about the weather, did something to Dale that 8 months of Clara's quiet pressure had been building toward. He drove home from the hospital and sat in his truck in the driveway for a long time. Then, he went inside, found the folded piece of paper Clara had left next to his coffee cup 6 weeks earlier, still in his shirt pocket, transferred through 3 different shirts because he had kept moving it without knowing quite why, and he opened it and read the name. Margaret Okafor. Environmental Law. Billings, Montana. He put the paper on the kitchen counter without comment. Clara came in from the garden 20 minutes later, dirt on her gloves, and saw it sitting there. She looked at Dale. He was staring out the window over the sink. "Pete doesn't look good," he said. "I know," she said gently. "I have notes," he said. "In the truck. I've been keeping notes since last fall." Clara pulled off her garden gloves slowly. She set them on the counter. She did not say anything yet, because she understood, in the way that she understood most things about this man, that what was happening right now was delicate, like a deer at the edge of a tree line, and the wrong movement would end it. "Okay," she said. "I'm not saying I'm going to call her tomorrow," Dale said. "Okay," Clara said again. "I'm saying I have notes." "I heard you, Dale." He turned from the window. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, in a way he had been avoiding for months because looking at her meant seeing what she saw, and seeing what she saw meant he could no longer pretend he didn't know what needed to happen. "This is going to blow things up," he said. "You understand that. This isn't just filing a complaint with some office in Helena. If I go on record about what I saw, and if it leads where I think it leads, this is going to blow up everything in this county." "I know," Clara said. "Harlow has people everywhere. The bank, the sheriff's office, I know, Dale. It could blow up the ranch." Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at her husband with an expression that was not fierce or triumphant. It was something more complicated, a kind of deep, steady sorrow that was not surrender. "It could blow up the ranch if we do something," she said. "But, Dale, what happens to this ranch if we do nothing? What happens to the water table in 10 years? What happens when Nate wants to bring his family here? What happens to Pete Ashford, and whoever comes after Pete?" She paused. "What happens to you? What kind of man are you going to be at the end of all this, if you stay quiet?" That last question landed somewhere in him that nothing else had reached. Because Dale Mercer had spent his whole life building a certain kind of man, a man of integrity, a man whose word meant something, a man the land could count on. And, somewhere in the past 3 years, without ever making a single conscious decision to betray that man, he had been doing exactly that. Every morning he had woken up and chosen silence, he had chipped something away from the person he had spent his whole life trying to be. He picked up the paper with Margaret Okafor's name on it. "I'll call her Monday," he said. He called her Monday. The conversation lasted 53 minutes, and Dale spent the first 20 of them choosing his words so carefully that Margaret Okafor, who had been doing this work for 19 years, later told her associate that she'd had clients who took 3 sessions to say what this rancher said in under an hour. His notes were organized. His observations were specific. His memory for detail was the kind of memory that comes from spending your life paying close attention to a piece of land, precise, grounded, unembellished. By the end of the call, Margaret had agreed to travel to Cowboy County the following week to meet with Dale and Clara in person, and to begin the process of securing independent water testing on both Dale's property and Pete Ashford's. The results of that testing came back 3 weeks later. They were not good. The groundwater on both properties showed elevated levels of several industrial chemicals, including compounds consistent with improperly disposed drilling waste, the kind of waste that required licensed disposal facilities and generated federal paperwork that, if handled improperly, constituted violations of multiple environmental statutes. Margaret reviewed the results, made several calls to contacts at the Environmental Protection Agency and the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, and came back to Dale and Clara with a face that was serious and careful. "This is real," she told them, sitting at their kitchen table with a thick folder in front of her. "And it's significant. But I need you to understand something. The moment we file a formal complaint and your name is attached to it, the dynamics in this county are going to change overnight. You need to be prepared for that." Dale looked at Clara. Clara looked at Dale. "We're prepared," Clara said. Dale nodded. One short, definitive nod, the kind that in his world meant the same thing as a signature. What happened over the next 6 weeks was not the clean, cinematic unfolding that stories sometimes make it seem. It was messy and frightening and exhausting, and there were moments when Dale questioned everything. The formal environmental complaint was filed in September 2020. Within 48 hours, word was out in Cowboy County because in a county of 9,000 people, word was always out within 48 hours. Dale received 2 phone calls that he did not answer. A truck he didn't recognize drove slowly past his property twice in 1 week. A man he had known for 20 years stopped returning his calls without explanation. The local paper ran a brief item about the environmental complaint that was factually accurate but framed in a way that made Dale feel, as he put it to Clara, like the bad guy in someone else's story. He found out through a third party that Vincent Harlow had already retained 3 attorneys. He went on with his work. He fed his cattle and checked his fences and ate his dinner and went to bed. But Clara noticed that he was sleeping better than he had in over a year. That the rigidity was gone from his jaw at breakfast. That he had stopped starting sentences and then stopping himself midway, the verbal equivalent of a man catching himself before he said too much. He had said the thing. He had done the thing. And, whatever came next, it was coming at him straight instead of from behind, and Dale Mercer was the kind of man who could handle almost anything as long as it came at him straight. But Clara also knew that what had been set in motion was larger than either of them had fully anticipated. Margaret Okafor had begun sharing the water testing results with federal contacts, and those contacts had begun asking questions that went beyond 2 ranchers' well water. Because the chemicals found on Dale's property did not match the profile of agricultural runoff or standard industrial contamination. They matched, with uncomfortable precision, the profile of illegally dumped drilling waste and Cavern Ridge LLC, it turned out, held a subsidiary relationship with a petroleum services company that operated in 3 states. This was no longer just a Cowboy County story. Margaret called Dale on a Thursday morning in October and told him she had been contacted by a federal environmental crimes investigator who wanted to speak with him. Dale was quiet for a moment on the phone. "Okay," he said. "Dale, this is going to get bigger," Margaret said. "Significantly bigger. I want to make sure you understand what that means." "I understand," he said. What he did not say, what he could not quite find words for yet, was what was actually happening inside him in that moment. Because Dale Mercer had spent 3 years carrying a weight that had bent him slowly, silently, in ways that had damaged things he cared about, his sleep, his marriage, his sense of himself. And now that weight was out in the open. Now it had a legal file number and a federal case contact and an attorney making calls on his behalf, and the fear was still there, real and cold and specific, but underneath the fear was something he hadn't felt in 3 years. It felt like the ground under his feet again. Solid. Real. His. He hung up the phone and walked out to the barn to check on his animals, and the morning air hit his face with the clean, thin cold of a Montana October, and Dale Mercer, who was not a man given to emotional display of any kind, stopped walking for a moment in the middle of his own yard and just breathed. Down the hill in the kitchen, Clara was pouring her second cup of coffee. She didn't know about the federal investigator yet. He would tell her tonight, over dinner, and she would set down her fork and reach across the table and squeeze his hand, and neither of them would say much, because by then, there would not be very much left to say. But right now, in this moment, she was just drinking her coffee. And Dale was just breathing cold air in his own yard on his own land. And the silence between them, for the first time in 3 years, was clean. But the hardest part had not yet arrived. Because filing a complaint is one thing. Sitting across a table from a federal investigator and putting your name on a sworn statement is another. And what Dale Mercer did not know yet, what neither of them knew as that October morning settled in around them, was that the federal investigation was about to uncover something that made the water contamination look like the beginning of a much longer and darker story. Something that would test both of them in ways that the past 3 years had only been preparation for. Something that would require Dale to make a final move that nobody in Cowboy County would see coming. Not even Clara. The federal investigator's name was David Reyes, and he drove out to the Mercer Ranch on a Wednesday morning in late October in a plain dark sedan that looked out of place against the backdrop of dry grass and open sky. He was younger than Dale had expected, mid-40s, lean, with the kind of watchful patience that told you he had learned how to sit still in the presence of difficult truths without flinching. He brought a colleague, a woman named Torres, who said very little but wrote down everything. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Clara had first set down Margaret Okafor's name 6 months earlier, and Dale talked for 3 hours. He told them everything. The August night in 2019. The trucks. The men in hazmat gear. The hoses going into the drainage swale. The cattle deaths. Pete Ashford's well. The timeline of his own water degradation. He pulled out the notes he had kept in the glove box of his truck, pages of them by now, and laid them on the table in order by date. Reyes looked at the notes with an expression that did not change much, but Dale noticed the man's eyes sharpen the way a hunting dog's do when it catches a scent on the wind. The red-bearded man at the Harlow equipment lot, Reyes said, toward the end of the session. Do you remember what month you saw the truck there? February, Dale said. February and March both. The truck had a dent in the rear quarter panel on the driver's side. I noticed it because the same dent was there both times. Reyes wrote something down. Torres wrote something down. Mr. Mercer, Reyes said, closing his folder. I want you to understand something. What you've given us today fits into a pattern of evidence we've been building for about 14 months. Some of what you've told us confirms things we suspected but couldn't verify. Some of it is new information that changes the shape of what we're looking at. Dale said nothing. He waited. The contamination on your property isn't an isolated incident, Reyes said. Cavern Ridge LLC is a shell entity. It was created specifically to acquire land in 3 counties here, 2 parcels in Wyoming, 1 in South Dakota, and use those parcels as unlicensed disposal sites for petroleum drilling waste generated by a parent company operating out of North Dakota. That parent company has been paying people to look the other way for a long time. People in county offices. People in state regulatory positions. He paused. And, based on what you've told us today, at least one person in law enforcement in this county. Dale stared at the table for a moment. The sheriff, he said. It was not quite a question. Reyes didn't confirm it directly. But he didn't deny it either, and Dale had lived in Cowboy County long enough to read what was in the space between a federal investigator's words. What happens now? Clara said. She had been sitting at the far end of the table, quiet the entire session, her hands folded in front of her the way they always were when she was paying very close attention. We file, Reyes said. Criminal referrals to the federal prosecutor's office. Civil environmental enforcement actions through the EPA and DEQ. Asset seizures if we can get the warrants, which I believe we can. He looked at Dale. And, we are going to need you. Formally. Sworn testimony, deposition, potentially trial testimony if it comes to that. It will come to that, Dale said. Probably, Reyes agreed. Dale looked at Clara. Clara looked at Dale with the steady, clear expression that had carried both of them through the past 3 years. She gave him the smallest nod, not pushing him this time, because she didn't need to anymore. She was just telling him she was there. Tell me what you need, Dale said to Reyes. The months that followed were unlike anything Dale had experienced in his 53 years on this earth. The federal case moved with the slow, grinding momentum of large institutional machinery, warrants and depositions and document subpoenas and grand jury proceedings that Dale was not allowed to discuss with almost anyone. Margaret Okafor navigated the legal dimensions on his behalf with a competence that regularly made him grateful Clara had found her. Reyes checked in every few weeks. The investigation spread wider than Dale had imagined it could, eventually touching a state regulatory official in Helena, 2 mid-level employees of the parent company who chose cooperation over prosecution, and a longtime county commissioner who had approved the original land use permits for the Cavern Ridge parcels without the required environmental review. And Vincent Harlow. The charges against Harlow came down in March 2021. Federal environmental crimes. Wire fraud. Conspiracy. The filing ran to 41 pages. Dale read every one of them at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, slowly, with Clara sitting across from him drinking tea. It was strange, reading it. He had expected to feel something dramatic, triumph, maybe, or relief, or some version of the righteous satisfaction that stories like this are supposed to deliver. Instead, what he felt was more complicated and quieter than that. He felt tired. He felt sad, in a way he hadn't anticipated, for the county he loved and for the people in it who had trusted men like Harlow and been deceived by that trust for decades. He felt something for Pete Ashford, who was managing but not fully well, and for the other property owners who had been identified in the investigation as having contaminated groundwater without ever knowing why. And, underneath all of it, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time, a bone-deep sense of having done the thing that needed to be done. He put down the last page of the filing. Clara looked at him across the table. "You okay?" she said. "Yeah," he said. He thought about it for a moment. "Yeah, I really am." The trial, when it came, was in federal court in Billings. Dale testified for 2 days. He wore the same suit he'd worn to his daughter Lori's wedding, which Clara had pressed carefully the night before without commenting on it. He sat in the witness chair and spoke in his flat, deliberate way, no drama, no performance, just the facts as he had observed them and recorded them, delivered in the order they had occurred, with the same precision he brought to everything in his life. Margaret had told him that prosecutors loved witnesses like him. He was not the kind of man you could rattle on cross-examination, because rattling required somewhere soft to get purchase, and Dale Mercer, under oath about something he knew to be true, had no soft places. Vincent Harlow's defense team tried for 2 hours on cross-examination to find inconsistencies in Dale's account. They questioned the lighting conditions on the night of August 2019. They questioned his ability to identify hazmat gear at a distance. They questioned why he had waited 3 years before coming forward, and whether that delay indicated uncertainty about what he had actually seen. It didn't indicate uncertainty, Dale said. It indicated fear. I was afraid of what it would cost me to say it out loud. I was wrong to wait as long as I did. But what I saw clearly. The courtroom was quiet for a moment after that. He drove home that evening. Clara had dinner ready. They ate together without talking much about the day, because both of them were too tired and because the day had said what it needed to say without being discussed. After dinner, Dale sat on the porch in the early spring dark, listening to the sounds the ranch made at night, the cattle moving in the south pasture, a coyote somewhere far off on the ridge, the low wind in the grass. Clara brought him a cup of coffee and sat down beside him without being asked. "Lori called," she said. "She wanted to know how it went." "What did you tell her?" I told her father told the truth in front of a federal court and it was exactly what you'd expect from him. Clara paused. She cried a little. Dale was quiet for a moment. Kids shouldn't cry over things like that. She cried because she was proud of you, Clara said. He didn't say anything to that. He drank his coffee and looked out at the dark shape of his land against the darker sky. The verdicts came in July 2021. Vincent Harlow was convicted on 6 counts, including conspiracy to violate the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act and 2 counts of federal wire fraud. He was sentenced to 7 years. The state regulatory official received 4 years. The county commissioner, who had cooperated with investigators, received a reduced sentence of 18 months and was removed from office. The parent petroleum company paid a civil penalty that ran into 8 figures and was required to fund the full remediation of all contaminated sites across the 3 states. Remediation of Dale's property began in the fall of 2021 and took 14 months. He watched the environmental crews work his south pasture every day during those months, the soil testing, the extraction equipment, the slow, painstaking process of pulling something poisonous out of the ground his grandfather had broken 90 years ago. It was not pleasant to watch. It was not easy to watch. But he watched it because he thought it was important to witness what his silence had allowed to happen and what speaking up had made it possible to undo. Pete Ashford's property was remediated simultaneously. Pete came over one afternoon while the crews were still working and stood next to Dale at the fence line and looked at the equipment for a long while without saying much. "I heard what you did," Pete said finally. "With the lawyer. The federal people. Clara's the one who pushed it," Dale said. Pete shook his head slowly. "I know Clara. Clara didn't put you in that witness chair." He was quiet a moment. "Thank you, Dale." Dale nodded. They stood there together for a while in the way of men who have known each other a long time and do not need to fill silence with words. People asked Dale, in the years that followed, what had finally made him do it. What had broken the silence after 3 years? And he always answered honestly, which was that it had not been one thing. It had been the accumulation of things: Pete Ashford in the hospital, his own water going bad, the notes he had been keeping in secret as if preparing for a moment he was terrified to arrive at. It had been the slow, grinding pressure of his own conscience, which had never stopped running underneath the fear even when fear was loudest. But, when people asked him, he also always said this: he would not have gotten there without Clara. Not in time. Maybe not at all. Because fear is very good at keeping a man in place, especially when the fear is real and the stakes are real and the man has spent his whole life defining himself by his ability to handle things quietly and alone. Fear offers you 100 reasons to wait one more day. And if the person next to you is willing to wait with you, to absorb your silence, to pretend not to see what they see, then you can wait indefinitely. Clara hadn't pretended. She hadn't absorbed it. She had refused, with a quiet ferocity that was entirely her own, to become a participant in his silence. She had pushed him not because she was brave in ways he was not. She had been frightened too, he knew that, but because she had decided that some things mattered more than the comfort of not being frightened. She had decided that he mattered more than that. That the land mattered. That Pete Ashford mattered. That the person Dale Mercer was supposed to be, the one he had spent his whole life building, mattered too much to be quietly dismantled by fear, one silent morning at a time. He told her all of this one evening in the spring of 2022, sitting on the porch where they had sat 100 times before. The remediation was finished. The water tested clean. The cattle were healthy. The south pasture was coming back green in ways that felt almost excessive, like the land itself was making a point. Clara listened to everything he said without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You would have gotten there," she said. "Eventually." "Maybe," Dale said. "Probably too late." She shook her head slightly. "I don't think so. I think you were already getting there before I started pushing. I just shortened the trip." He thought about that. He thought she was probably being generous, the way she always was. But he also thought she might be a little bit right. "Either way," he said, "I'm glad you didn't stop." She picked up her coffee and looked out at the land, their land, still theirs, cleaner now than it had been in years and carrying less weight than it had in a very long time. I was never going to stop, she said simply. And that was the thing about Clara Mercer that the federal investigators and the attorneys and the jury foreman and the county officials who had eventually reckoned with what happened in Callaway County would never quite understand, because they only saw the outcome. They saw a rancher who came forward, who testified, who helped bring down a years-long criminal enterprise that had poisoned land in 3 states. They did not see the 8 months of kitchen table mornings. They did not see the paper left next to the coffee cup. They did not see the woman who looked at her husband's frightened silence and chose, every single day, to stand in front of it and refuse to let it become permanent. They saw the final move. They did not see the 1,000 small moves that made it possible. But Dale saw them. He had seen every one of them. And he knew, in the way that a man knows the land he has lived on his whole life, the way he knows what it costs and what it gives back and what it asks of you when it asks, that the most important thing that had happened in those 3 years was not the verdict, and not the remediation, and not the federal charges. It was a woman who had refused to stop pushing. And a man who had finally, mercifully, let himself be moved.